So like, what topics did you like want to talk about?
Mostly the gun control thing. You said that you're like all for like free access to guns or whatever.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sure. So, I mean, basically, I would have to ask, like, what is your normative ethics framework?
Are you asking me like, so, I guess, are you asking me like what my ethical position is? Like,
Like
the label?
utilitarianism, deontology, like, what's
Oh
your
yeah,
like?
so like, generally speaking, I guess I would call myself, um, I guess a consequentialist, right?
Sure.
So
So,
like,
like, go ahead.
good. So yeah, I wouldn't say something like I'm obligated to maximize people's well-being. I would generally just say that any and all actions are just and fine to do as long as they don't, like, in consequence, decrease people's well-being.
So, would you say that, like, just so we're working on like the same level here, like, you would still be against like people going out and murdering others with guns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I can like give you an explanation as to why I'm pretty light on gun restrictions, if there are at all any. Typically, I want to have guns in people's control because there's two main reasons. There's obviously self-defense, and there's obviously defense from a government. And I do agree that there's a lot of gun violence that is unjustified or bad, but I think that we can have alternative solutions to those issues while not necessarily giving up our ability to defend ourselves from other people or the government.
So just so we're clear, like, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't be in favor of things like background checks for like purchasing guns, right?
Um, I wouldn't. Are you talking about like? I wouldn't be like necessary like background checks is in businesses that sell guns. The government is telling them that they have to run some kind of check on a person and decide who and who cannot have a gun.
Pretty much. I mean, like, there are different ways to go about doing it, like checking for like a history of crime, a history of violent crime, seeing if they've been like posting threats to people on social media, that kind of stuff. Just basic common sense things like, hey, is this going to be a dangerous person? And if they are, probably don't sell them a gun.
Okay. So I mean, generally, I guess they would have already had to have done something to like be prevented from getting a gun anyway. Um, if you want to talk about like uh background, if you wanted people to like have to get like mandatory background checks, and like in the case that they've literally murdered somebody with a gun, I mean, I don't even know that I would say that I would prevent that. I would think theoretically, if somebody were to have murdered somebody with a gun, and then they were released on what is it called? They were released from prison. Um, I would think hopefully take away their privilege to have a gun just from that. I guess if I had to compare it to something, I would say if somebody like went to you, right, they went to like a car dealership asking to buy a car, but you looked at their history and they'd have been arrested for drunk driving or hitting somebody with a car, right? I don't think we would like not sell them a car because of that. So, I mean, I don't really think.
Sure, but I think that there's a like a meaningful difference between a car, which is generally used as like transportation from like say home to work or home to school or whatever, right? Versus like just having a gun around because that doesn't really have much of a purpose aside from like shooting people or things, right?
Um, I don't know if I would deny it the comparability just because of the purposes. So like a gun obviously doesn't have to have immoral purposes strictly. Same with a car. I think it's the same thing as in they committed a crime with it, and you wouldn't deny them based upon that. But I think that like you should be able to give people guns to defend themselves, or to be able to use it for sport, etc.
Right. So like I would say that the comparison, sure, if we want to like extrapolate it, right? Say that like someone commits some crime with like a hot dog, right? I don't think it should be illegal for that person to ever buy a hot dog, right? That seems a little bit intense. But like if someone like goes around shooting like a bunch of kids, then we probably shouldn't let that person have a gun, right? So I would say
Well,
that
I
like
think if people,
food versus a gun isn't analogous in the same way that I would say like a car and a gun isn't analogous.
Well, I mean, I would think that if somebody shot up a school full of children, they would probably not be released from jail anytime soon to get any form of weaponry anyway. And even if they were, I would say that likely the ability to not sell them a gun is not something that needs gun control, but rather we should be switching to a reformative justice type system anyway. This kind of goes along the lines of what I mentioned earlier. I think there are ways to solve problems that have to deal with guns that don't limit our ability to defend ourselves in some scenarios, right? So, I mean, you said you wouldn't like compare it to like I guess a school shooting. I mean, fine, in the extreme examples I wouldn't either, but I would say in the extreme examples we would ideally have a better like justice system to like take away that ability. I think it's also worth noting if we want to talk about cars that there are a lot more car crash deaths and I guess car deaths in general than gun deaths are anyway. So like the risk factor is definitely higher in that scenario as well. I do think they're still comparable.
There are also a lot more cars in America, at least. I don't know about like worldwide, but I think that there are like most guns are in America, but there are still even more cars, and cars are being used a whole lot more in America. So saying like, oh, there are more car deaths compared to guns, I don't think that that's fair at all.
Well, I don't think you can make that statement based on the number of cars because people usually have maybe two or three cars, but typically when they're going out for a drive, it's either one person going out for a drive in one car or a family going out for a drive in one car. I guess like my dad has a truck and my mom has like a car, but whenever we travel, we're like 90% using the car, right? I don't think you can really just say it's inappropriate just because they're more net total, right?
I'm just saying, like, going out on the street, like, how many cars do you just see, like, around, like, open area downtown, like, of any city, right? Versus how many guns do you see just out and about downtown in any city, right? Like, you can still say there are a lot more guns in big cities, but you don't see them very often where you see a ton of cars, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just supports that the risk is a lot higher for cars because people don't even use guns as much as they do for cars, right? But if we want to talk about like fundamentally comparing the two, um, it comes down to they committed an illegal act with it. Um, Presumably, if they had done some form of justice or whatever, like we wouldn't like deny car to a person who had done a hit and run, whether it be intentional or not. Presumably, would not do the same thing with a gun, and then of course even if they had done something extremely heinous with the gun, I think that we can reform our justice system to be more rehab focused, which rehab oriented justice systems in the world are better at lowering recidivism rate so that we don't compromise our ability to defend ourselves.
Sure. So I would say that, like, I kind of agree, but also like I feel there's a meaningful difference between like the potential to like use a car versus the potential to use a gun for the various actions, right? So a car you would use primarily as transportation. Sometimes it's like it's to sustain your own livelihood, right? You have to go to work in a car a lot of the time, right? Otherwise, you just couldn't live. Whereas, like, if you take away someone's gun, they're probably just gonna keep living, right? Like, I don't think most people are like going out and hunting for their own food, right? At least not most people with guns, anyway.
That's true. I think that so you're bringing up like how there's potential to use a car. The potential, sorry, to use a car is much more likely to be in a non-immoral sense than the potential to use a gun if both are to be used, right?
Absolutely.
Right, and I do think that that's true in a lot of cases. However, this is a good segment into kind of talking about how and why guns are used to kill people. So you would obviously agree that a lot of times, maybe not like the vast majority, but a lot of times guns are used to legitimately save lives, right?
Um, sure, maybe. I don't know. I don't know the numbers
Yeah,
on.
I mean we can like look at the number if you want to, but like I don't know that it's like a statement worth contending over.
Sure. I mean, like, I would say that I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that like at least in like home invasion scenarios, it's actually more helpful to like use a baseball bat than like a gun. But I would say that like police officers having guns probably is a good thing, although maybe they could use non-lethal rounds most of the
Um,
time when they use lethal rounds. I don't know. It's real weird.
I would actually I can talk about it later, but I would use the police as like more of an example of why we should have guns. But
You think that people
Essentially,
should
like
have
when you
guns to
look,
protect themselves from the police? You want like
oh,
people to like
absolutely,
massacre police all the time? Yeah.
absolutely, right. There's a the fact that crime is going down in America generally, but police are getting more and more militarized, and the fact that they can be utilized as a weapon employed by the state, as we see in protests, or the fact that like police brutality is rising, absolutely, we need to be able to protect ourselves from the police.
I would say
Um,
a better way of going about it is just stopping most police officers from having like lethal rounds, right? Maybe take away some guns from a lot of police officers. Only include like guns in like SWAT team vans or whatever, right?
So I don't know necessarily how able that's going to be the case. So like the SWAT team, for instance, was heavily funded back when they were like first starting for like high priority targets. But when people like started realizing they weren't getting deployed as much, right? They were kind of getting angry that like their money was being misused in a way that it wasn't needed. So what the government did was they started like, lowering the level of priority necessary for the SWAT team to actually raid. I think there's like been I can't remember the exact number, but like a several hundred or several thousand times increase in the number of SWAT team deployments since then, right? It would seem like there's an incentive for the government to actually deploy like these forces onto people even more. I don't know like how necessarily like probable or practical it would be to just somehow get them to stop, militarizing their police force.
Sure. So it feels like we're kind of getting away from the topic a little bit. I would say that, like, obviously, I'm also in favor of like decreasing like how often SWAT teams are called on people, right? It seems a little excessive. But I also think that maybe taking away guns from like regular police officers and then having it so like maybe only the police officers that don't have guns can call in SWAT teams, maybe that would be effective. I don't know, but it feels like we're getting a little bit far away from gun control in general, right?
Sure, we can pull it back in. This is more along the lines of why I think that we should have it rather than why I think it's necessary to restrict it. We can kind of pull it back into like talking about I think the comparison between like guns and cars that you mentioned. I guess what I was like saying was a lot of like gun violence is used in self-defense, obviously, but I think a lot of people don't realize that a large portion of the statistics of like gun violence are caused by stolen guns rather than bought guns or some form of suicide, right? So I think that
Actually, I don't think that's true.
I'm not saying it's a majority of it, right? I'm not saying it's a majority. I'm saying it's like a large portion of those like
So
numbers.
the vast majority of like traced crime guns, right, lead back to, I think it was like 5% of gun dealers. Like, it's ridiculous, right? So I would be in favor
Yeah,
of like that 5% of gun dealers that are selling to people who are going out committing crimes absolutely need to be at least running background checks, if not shut down altogether. And I have
yeah.
sources for that if you want to read.
I don't necessarily need sources for that because I know that that's statistically true. The point that I was bringing up was just about at least clarifying at least a portion of that are things that we can legitimately focus on that need to be addressed in ways more than gun control because they're just using guns to like I guess for the suicide ones, or obviously they're using them for like their practicality and how quick it is. As far as like legitimate gun violence crime against another person goes, I can't remember exactly what was the motivating cause of it. I think it was like I think I want to say it was gang wars, or some sort of gang related activity.
Sure.
So you have to like bear with me, right? I think that we can control or greatly reduce gang wars, right? In a way that's meaningful, or we can reduce that kind of criminal activity in a way that's meaningful, right? Without necessarily having to put any kind of like heavy, I guess, gun restriction in motion. The main reason that these things occur, right? Obviously, there's a lot of socioeconomic factors in charge. Obviously, the crime rates are kind of like hyperbolized in a way by they're only measured by convictions, and you're more likely to be convicted if you're blah blah blah, right? There's like a bunch of stuff with that. I think these can be meaningfully reduced um, in ways like, I don't know, reparation or policies passed to kind of construct a better environment in like the communities these are primarily happening in. Because I do legitimately think that the two reasons that I have for not wanting gun restrictions are so important that it is worth kind of solving the issues related with them in ways that don't require gun restriction so that we don't have to compromise our defense. And I think that's generally why I would be against it.
Sure. So like I'm in favor of like the things that you described of like reparations and stuff, right? And I do think that like overwhelmingly like gang wars could be stopped through like criminal justice reform even, or like ending the war on drugs, right? I think these things would have meaningful impacts on the number of gun deaths in America. But I also think that like if you implement some form of gun control, even something as like little as background checks on like the national level, I still think that that would also be helpful, right?
Okay. It would be helpful, but I don't think nearly as meaningfully as so as the others. And even if you were to implement both, I think that the compromisation would not be worth it. You know Norway, right? Pretty cool country.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, I'm sure you know this, but like their murder rate is insanely low, especially with guns. That's just murder rate in general, not even like controlled for just guns. It's like among the lowest in the world, with I want to say a 0.7 or 0.8% murder rate for every 100,000 people.
Yeah.
And they're able, yeah, so like they're able to do that for a reformative justice system, and I think that that's a beneficial thing to do, and I think we could do it without compromising the two reasons I gave, and I think that this conversation should probably flow into maybe why the two are important to not compromise. I think that would probably be the best way to go about this. So, would you like me to kind of further my reasoning for like those two reasons for like defense against government and people?
So I would like to kind of address some of your points because you're running
Yeah,
through a
go
lot.
ahead.
So one of the things that I let slip by, and I'm gonna go back to it now. Sorry. The thing about the like gang wars, right? And about how most of those crimes are committed using illegally purchased guns. Um, I completely whiffed on like addressing this. Most of those illegally purchased guns, if we trace it back a few more steps, were bought legally, right? So it's like someone went to a legal gun store, right? Bought a gun, brought it into a city where maybe there is some form of gun control, and then sold it to, say, a gang illegally, right? And so if we just implemented background checks across the board, then that would probably cut down on the number of people who are buying guns legally and then selling them illegally, right?
So I would like have to disagree with that. There's like if you're like trading it back from somebody buying it legally to somebody selling it, right? I wouldn't be in favor of like having to impose background checks because one, um, obviously those people who are selling the guns don't necessarily have to adhere to them. There's like been a lot of reports that it's really easy to get your like hands on a firearm, even if they're really really young, or even if they do background. There's a lot of articles on those to give some sort of like background check power for like government to like make a policy over, right? And all of a sudden they have control over that policy. I feel like that's a very real like issue with whether or not a slippery slope is established to where the government now has control over the requirements are to buy a gun. They can like suddenly make it so that you're not able to buy a gun, right? Or the average person even. I do think those are some issues.
Well, no, so it wouldn't be targeting like the average person because the average person isn't like buying guns en masse and then selling them off to guns in like inner cities, right?
Hello?
Hello, are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. At what point did I cut out?
As, like as soon as you began.
Okay. So I would say that it wouldn't be targeting like the average person, right? Because the average person isn't buying guns en masse and then selling them off to like gangs in inner cities.
Oh, I don't think it would initially be targeting the person. However, I do have like reason
Hello? Is Forks talking? Can anybody else hear me?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello, hello?
No, I can. I couldn't hear you earlier.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Now you are.
Okay. So it would seem to me that we shouldn't allow for that slippery slope to exist at all, because obviously as soon as they begin who's able to buy what gun, right, and they have power over like those requirements, I do think it's possible and a very real danger that they're able to impose restrictions on those things or enforce them in a way that would restrict most people or a lot of people from having them. I think this is a very real threat based on a lot of things that have happened in the U.S. I listed a few of them earlier. There was, the rise in police militarization and police brutality, which could be an even worse problem if the government keeps going down that road of, having these people with a lot of power over citizens, more so than usual. But there's also the fact that we literally, right, just inducted a fascist president into like the White House, right? And like maybe not in policy. I do think Trump's too incompetent to enact any policy like that. But he has expressed opinions like
It's
if people are not.
proto-fascist.
Yeah, like have you like seen his tweets about if you're like not a nationalist, if you're expressing like free speech against the nation, like burning a flag, you should be deported and removed from the country.
Yeah,
Like
he's
that's
insane. I'm not here to defend Trump.
yeah. I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying that there's like a lot of really yikesy things going on that don't make it seem impossible that giving power to the government over our lives could be like an issue with slippery slope.
Sure, I'm in favor of taking away like lethal guns. I'm in favor of like demilitarizing the police as well, right? So why wouldn't that also be effective?
Because I don't because so what you're talking about you're talking about reforming these types of things. However, if you have like I don't want to call her, because obviously I wouldn't call our country authoritarian yet. If you're to have an authoritarian nation or a nation that's like strong centrally, you aren't necessarily going to be able to just remove things through reformation. You kind of have to be like revolutionary with it, right? I think that if you give this power to defend yourself away, you can't trust that they'll demilitarize the police. I mean, the government's been using the police for a while now to suppress people's marches, right? We've seen it all the time where the police literally create riot-like scenarios and beat people or kill people.
Right, but we also see plenty of like politicians and people speaking out against like the militarization of the police, right? So
Yeah,
I wouldn't say that it's impossible for us to make progress, right? I don't think we need to have a revolution. Even though like there's some disagreement on like how fast we should change to like ease people into it or just immediately switch, right? I think that we can still make progress through reformation.
we can, and I'm not here to like have a like role play session about I think we should head the socialist revolution or whatever the hell. But
Okay.
there are yeah, I'm not here to like LARP about it, but there are people that have been like voicing their opinion about demilitarizing the police, and it's not gotten us anywhere. They've only been getting more militarized. And as the political climate kind of normalizes that and accepts it as it continues to grow more normal, right? Because more people, we literally have people justifying these types of things all the time, both on social media, both on literally professional news outlets. As this like type of behavior grows more normalized, we can't just necessarily say that we can use our democratic system to like enforce change that most people in power rather wouldn't want to happen. We kind of would not want to give up those rights that we would have.
Yeah, I mean, but if we're appealing to like what most people, even most people in power want to happen, right? Then it's like, well, overwhelmingly Americans, gun owners and non-gun owners want like at least background checks on gun sales, right?
Yeah, I don't even know that that's necessarily, even if that's like true, I don't even know if that would necessarily work. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that most people want some form or another of universal health care. And they have for a while now, and yet anything like that being passed is not even remotely going to happen in the next few years at least. We don't actually really have that democratic of a system anymore, because typically what happens, I guess we have like a minor kind of ability to alter what happens, but usually what happens is there are really rich interest groups who kind of dictate what happens in an oligarchic style, right? So if you were to say, well, demilitarize the police or, gun bans, etc., what people like, companies who want to suppress their union workers or the government who wants to suppress people who are going on protests, what those people and those interest groups are hearing is something they don't want, and they'll actively try against it. And they have a lot more power than the individual does. I don't think it's really pragmatic to expect reform to make this change in any meaningful amount of time.
So, I mean, okay, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, I would like to say that, on the topic of, what was it, the healthcare for all, the Medicare for all thing Bernie was running on, right?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily what he was running on, but, that kind of general idea, right? I just want to point out that, yes, majority of people are in favor of it, but then when you bring up that it would take away their private insurance, all of a sudden that number just drops through the floor to 20 to 30% of people are in favor of it. But if you tell them that, hey, you still get to choose whether you want the public system or you want your private insurance, then it's back up to 50 to 60%. So it's depending on how you frame the question, it impacts whether or not a majority of people want it at all, right? And that 50 to 60% answer where it's hey, you still get the option between your private insurance versus the public system is actually, it seems like that's what Biden wants to implement, right? That's at least what Pete Buttigieg was in favor of, and it seems like Biden's kind of going down the same path. So I wouldn't say that it's fair to say that that's not going to happen in the near future. I mean, we'll see what happens in November, but I wouldn't say it's out of the question, right? I would say that the democratic process is still working, right?
Can I ask you a question? I don't know if you'll find it of much relevance, but do you think it's possible that the perception on how harmful it would be to completely deprivatize, at least in the sense that we're talking universal health care, do you think it's possible that the very special interest groups who are making millions, if not actually billions of dollars off of that private health care is putting out propaganda and making it kind of a common theme that it would be a bad thing to do that? Do you think that's possible? Or
yeah, I mean, it's possible that they're putting out propaganda, but at the same time, I don't think most Americans are paying attention half enough to actually have that kind of propaganda influence their opinions. I think people just hear, I'm losing my private insurance that my union has lobbied for, whatever, right? And they're oh no, that's bad.
Yeah,
I don't know that there's necessarily propaganda involved
behind
that.
I mean, I think there is some, but even if you wanted to just talk about the dogmatic acceptance of deprivatization bad, you can certainly make the argument that a lot of that is brought about by the same people who have kind of incentives to keep Medicare or medical insurance, all that, right? Private, right? Because they're what's the word? They're profiting it off of it heavily, right? So these public, it's gotten to the point, really, I would argue, that these public interest groups are not only able to have a disproportionate amount of representation in the political sphere, right? There's obviously, they can super PAC or fund much more heavily the politicians they want to get into office, but it would seem that they also have the ability to kind of make people just dogmatically accept things. I think that proposing that something like gun restrictions in what I would say a nation where most people don't think that that should occur is a little bit not pragmatic at all.
Most Americans are in favor of gun restrictions, though.
I don't, if that's true, I don't know if that's true. If that's true, I feel like that would support the point a little more, though, that not necessarily do we have a structure in which the amount of support makes things actually happen based upon who has the majority of it.
So, by and large, what you will find is people vote down party lines on this kind of stuff, right? The Democrats are mostly in favor of gun control, and the Republicans are mostly against it, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, if what was it? I think I read the number was if 3% more Americans were voting in every election, basically the Republican Party wouldn't even exist, right? That's how close it is, and that's why Republicans are fighting so hard for voter suppression, basically. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that a majority of people are in favor of gun control.
A majority of people, rather, I should say, with
The issue is that not all of them are voting, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, we'll see what happens here in November. It seems like, from the polling I've seen anyway, that Biden's going to win, at which point I would expect some form of gun control to be put into place. And at this point, you aren't so much arguing that gun control would be a bad thing as you're arguing it's impractical. And so now I'm trying to defend that it is kind of practical, depending on who we have in office, right?
Wait, sorry, I'm not trying to leave from the point that it's a bad thing. I'm trying to leave from the point that I'm trying to apply impracticality to kind of like these ideas of demilitarizing the police and all of that jazz, right? And it would matter, right, necessarily what's practical or not, because the ability to actually make the changes that you would want to occur so that you wouldn't necessarily need guns are so kind of out of reach because of the amount of like groups, like most like